Hi everyone, my name is Pulkit Agrawal and I'm the founder and CEO of The Fifth Ingredient. Huge shout out to Andrew Copeland and a thank you to the entire CBP community for having me on today for the fall virtual conference. So today's topic is going to be WTF data, numbers equal profits. So my backstory real quick is that I studied mechanical engineering at Harvard University and then was recruited to work at Ballast Point Brewing in San Diego, California as an engineer, and particularly a process engineer focusing on the bottling, canning, kegging lines, helping them out with nitrogen beer production, and going from there when it comes to the actual bottling, canning, kegging lines and optimization. And after a few years, I started the Fifth Ingredient to really do consulting for breweries. And during that time, realized that so many breweries had paper logs, whiteboards, and spreadsheets, and yet we're still not truly tracking their data with a central source of truth. And that's where Beer 30 came about. And currently, Beer 30 is a end-to-end data management software system that breweries use to track their data from grain to glass. And we're nearly 400 breweries at this point. So moving on from that, really, what is the fifth ingredient? Just so we're all aware of the same thing. Four ingredients in beer: water, malt, hops, yeast, and the fifth ingredient is data. And the goal from today is hopefully you'll leave this presentation with this idea of data actually translates very nicely into numbers, which translates very nicely into profits for the brewery. And so the hope here is that after today's session, you really start looking at the three key elements for breweries' health, which are quality, efficiency, and sales. You're able to answer these four key questions. Number one, where do I start tracking data? And we're going to go over three areas of data management when it comes to data in the brewery and look at them in terms of them having issues with it. Question number two is going to be, how do I organize this data? And then we're going to take those information and turn that into three steps of brewery analytics. Question three is, what does that organized data actually look like? And we're going to revisit our issues from above and mark them with solutions. And then that all then leads together to question number four, WTF data, numbers equals profits. And we're going to go through 6 areas of profit analysis. And with that, we're going to have some final key takeaways. And hopefully you'll leave this session today with actionable items that you can take at your brewery when it comes to actually tracking the data, processes to actually organize the data, looking at it on a weekly, monthly basis, and then taking all of those particular data points and turning them into actionable insights so that way you can really focus on the profit analysis side of things. So with that, let's get going. The first aspect is a brewery's health, looking at quality, efficiency, and sales. And what that really means is that complacency kills a brewery. At this point, if you're not constantly moving and adapting and getting into becoming a better brewery overall, I'm just going to move me briefly. Quality, efficiency, and sales. If you're not focused on becoming a better brewery overall, complacency is going to kill. And at this point, we know that when it comes down to it, if your brewery is not making high quality beer, somebody's just going to go to the brewery right next door, right? And so you need to keep customers happy. If you're not basically focusing on efficiency, well, you're not going to be able to get your outputs done in time. And so effectively, if you're more efficient, you have more output that's being done in the same time with the same resources. And finally, looking at sales, you're really breaking this down to understand on ways that you can actually grow your profit margins. So again, a brewery's health is based on these key 3 aspects, and there definitely may be more, but these are the 3 that I like emphasizing: of quality, efficiency, and sales. From there, the first question that really comes down to it is, where do I start tracking the data, right? And what that really means is that when you start looking at it, is we're all trained to capture data and notes on paper, spreadsheets, whiteboards, but it can be really overwhelming to understand how to use that data, right? It's not very much of an easy A to B story. And so that's where things really come down to: how do you actually use that data to make profits, right? And that's really what the entire presentation is about and what we can do to actually tie that into the data. So when it comes down to this, let's actually look at 3 areas of data management. And in particular, we're going to call these 3 areas the issues that we're trying to solve, right? And so what that effectively means, I'm just going to move my face. What that means is that the 3 areas really dive in with process inefficiencies, high process cost, and getting into poor quality and inconsistency, right? And these are effectively the 3 key areas that I always want everybody to think about when they're looking at what's happening from a data management perspective. With these, let's go through different examples for each of these here. So number one, for process inefficiencies, we have production planning issues with tanks that are sitting empty or full for extra days, right? If your entire process is not working as a machine, where as soon as beer is ready to package, it's in the right tank, ready to package, it's packaged off, tank is empty, next that happens, it's really not going to be efficient. And so that's one key aspect of issues for management. We then start getting into redundant paper logs, whiteboards, end of shift email spreadsheets, extra hours that are spent on brewing, filtering, and packaging, and you're just not really familiar with why that's the case. You haven't really broken it down to understand how you make it more efficient. From number two, high process costs, you're looking at delayed reactions to issues as they arise, right? Brew, ferment, filter, bright tank, package yeast. You may finish brewing on a Friday, not touch the beer until you get back in on a Monday morning, Monday afternoon, and those 2.5 days that have transpired have actually led to issues in between, and you weren't aware of it and you weren't able to fix it, right? And so that really results in either potential loss of beer, or it could result in beer that's not within quality or it has very inconsistent flavor profiles. And so those all tie in together as well. Extra costs for grains, hops, cans, bottles, and supplies, right? If you're not being efficient about the entire process and you don't know exactly where those ingredients are coming from or have the best rates, you're going to have higher costs as well. And more importantly, unknown costs of goods sold per product. There are definitely many breweries that we come across that have that element where they don't actually know the full breakdown of each COGS for each beer, right? And realistically, you need to be able to break this down on a per package basis, per SKU, and really understand what the exact cost of goods are. And then finally, for poor quality and inconsistency, you may have to destroy a tank that is out of specification. Customers are going to be unhappy and they can go to a different brewery, or your brand reputation gets tarnished, right? And so effectively, these are three areas of data management that you're looking at with different issues that if you're not properly managing or maintaining your data sets and analyzing them, these are all potential flags. These are 9 red flags that could happen. But when you actually start tracking the data, let's actually focus on how do I organize the data. And this is where brewery analytics really becomes important. So the game plan here is that feedback from the data should be used to drive the business decisions. And what that means is that if you're properly doing data management, you're impacting daily operations, because if you're doing poor data management, it's actually going to be very time consuming and difficult. But if you do good data management, it's going to be fast and clear. And this is where there's an importance of power as well as flexibility. And really the question becomes, well, I have all this data, how do I organize it? And so what I want to provide for you is a 3-step framework of brewery analytics. And what that looks like is actually breaking things down when it comes to collection of the data, transforming the data, and then using that data for better prediction. And so collectively, what that all means is that when you're collecting the data, just track as much data as possible on the process side, right? Brew, ferment, filter, bright tank, package, yeast, track it all. Because effectively what you're going to have to do at that point is, as you're collecting the data, is also understand what are estimates versus exact readings, right? If you end up getting something where you don't necessarily have a proper flow meter, for example, and you're just using a sight glass to understand really just how many barrels are there as opposed to a flow meter, well, there's an estimate versus an exact reading there. Validate the instruments that you use to measure, right? Make sure that your pH meters are calibrated. We've come across a number of our customers that end up realizing that their pH numbers for fermentation are shifting over time because they aren't actually tracking the information properly with that. And even if they think that they're tracking it, the instrument just isn't calibrated, which is leading to other issues. From there, from a transformation step, organize the data that you've tracked into tables. And these tables should be split up into rows and columns. And you're going to be able to go from there when it comes to actually breaking things down to get better graphs and visual representations of the data, right? We're as humans, we pretty much end up understanding data far better when it's actually in a visual format rather than just a bunch of numbers, a bunch of spreadsheets, and really that visual representation is huge. And with that, you then start looking at the accuracy and precision for each particular data point as well and compare them side by side. Then from the prediction level, now that you've collected the data and you've transformed it into digestible content, you then start using the past data to make inferences on future events. And what that means is that you can actually provide success metrics and compare data points to the standards, right? So that basically means that if you have a particular fermentation curve that you expect your beer to take, if all of a sudden it's not taking that, you can start predicting and saying, well, it's day 2, it's nowhere near where the normal trend is. Well, let's see what happens tomorrow. Day 3, it's just as bad. Those are kind of the red flags that go off and tell you, hey, this is probably not going to work out when it comes to the beer itself, and you may need to intervene. From there, focus on tolerances, right? And validate each brew. This is such a critical piece because as you start looking at, well, this particular set point, whether it's my mash pH or my knockout pH, well, it should target this particular quantity. But then if I have X or Y above, let's say if my pH is 5.0 and I want it to be that, well, 4.8 to 5.1 is green, but then anything below that, let's say 4.6 to 5.3 is yellow, and then you have red, right? And so you can basically come up with different tolerances based on just how tight of a band you need based on the particular variable that you're looking at. And that's really where, as things start deviating, you can start focusing in on, well, what does this actually predict for me when it comes to the actual deviation and how it's going to be validated versus not. From there, let's actually look at what does organized data look like, right? And so I'm going to come back to the 3 key areas and looking at the examples and processes to basically come down to, well, the areas of data management we outlined above, let's actually turn those into solutions itself. So now, when we look at these 3 boxes, we're looking at improved efficiencies, we're looking at decreased process costs, and then we're looking at improved quality and consistency. And then what that looks like is here's some great examples for you to start thinking about as you start assessing your data. So you're maximizing the tank and equipment utilization, right? The goal is to avoid buying more equipment, and unless you really have maxed out capacity, and at that point it makes a lot of sense with that. Getting real-time process reports of what's happening at the brewery, and then really streamlining communication by removing redundant paperwork. Right? If you think about the number of hours that team members spend every week, month, year between writing something down on a piece of paper, then putting it into a spreadsheet, and then doing end of shift analysis, it's just very repetitive and redundant. And so this becomes a key area that ties in with data management. From there, let's look at decreased process cost. And that looks like proactively monitoring process outputs, downtimes, schedules, real-time alerts. Right? When you start thinking about downtime as a whole, if you go 1 day without brewing just based off of XYZ variables, you're looking at actually having downtime at your brewery, which actually results in real-time dollars, right? And so putting that into context, if you're doing a 10-barrel batch, a 30-barrel batch, 50-barrel batch, and you don't get that beer in the tank, well, that's another day that that tank is being underutilized. That's another day that the brew house isn't running. And basically, the way I like to think about it is the smell of wort is the smell of money, right? And so you basically have to make sure that you're proactively monitoring that to keep the process going. From there, improve the recipes and start optimizing those particular ingredients and really start breaking down, well, is there a way that I can shave off the dry hop bill here? Is there a way that I can make those adjustments without the recipe actually becoming a different brand or tasting very different? And from there, looking at the exact COGS that go into making each particular beer. Then we go into improving quality and consistency. And what that looks like is comparing 300 plus data points across all batches, right? When you start really breaking it down, data can be as granular as you want to get, right? And 300 plus data points is a great example of if you're really tracking everything when it comes to your particular batch from brewing, fermenting, filter, bright tank, package, raw material traceability, packaging supplies, where those beers went into the field, the exact cost of goods, profit margins, you'll realize that there's over 300 plus data points that are really being tracked, right? And this can become super overwhelming, but obviously there's softwares like Beer 30, or you can have other spreadsheets that you have that are interconnected, but the goal is that you're actually comparing to focus on quality and efficiency. From there, ensure customers are consistently drinking high quality beer. Again, if you're looking at it from a brand perspective and product loyalty, if at this point you don't have beer that people like drinking, you're just going to go right next door to the brewery and go from there on things, right? So this is where this all very nicely ties in together to make sure that you have proper quality and consistency. From there, let's actually look at WTF data, numbers equal profits in 6 areas. I just got a question in the chat, and remember, you can keep putting questions in the chat. One of the questions that really comes down with this is that it can become super, or the question is, how exactly would you go about implementing this at your brewery to make sure that people are actively tracking this? That's a great question. What that effectively tells me is that what you want to do is set up processes in place where your team members are checking in, whether on a weekly or fortnightly basis, so every other week. And you want to basically have a particular KPI, key performance indices, key performance index, KPIs that you care about for your brewery, right? And so if you're really figuring out how you actually want to implement this, having a KPI of something like, hey, how many days was there beer in all of my tanks, right? That's a great KPI. Looking at it from, hey, how many beers are hitting their particular target metric? That's another great KPI, right? And so now all of a sudden you have these data points that you're tracking, but there's an actual meeting that's dedicated to going through these KPIs and saying, hey, are we trending correctly or incorrectly, right? And that becomes one of the key aspects of actually going forwards when it comes to data and analysis and really breaking things down and really having those meetings that allow you to then look at each of these key areas. So great question as well. From there, the next aspect, question 4, is again getting into profit analysis. And so pretty much the way to think about this is that now that there's a better understanding of data, here are 6 areas in a brewery where you can actually use the numbers to do a profit analysis. And what those look like are, number 1, process optimization. Number 2, looking at quality control. Number 3, looking at inventory and material resource planning, MRP. Number 4, looking at cost of goods sold, so looking at your COGS. Number 5, looking at sales and distribution. And number 6, looking at time savings across the team, right? And this is that aspect of no matter what you have for the data, and again, this is where it becomes that overwhelming WTF data feeling that's there. When you start taking a pause and start looking at the numbers, you realize that there's a story that's being told by the numbers. And those numbers effectively then, when you analyze them, equal profits. And the key takeaway here today is when you actually start looking at this, that you'll realize, hey, these are some awesome key variables that I should be tracking and analyzing to get my profit analysis out. So with that, number 1, process optimization. Basically, the key thing here is to improve and control brew to package yield. And what that looks like is it results in increased output per batch, and it results in a reduced COGS per barrel, hectoliter, liter, whatever unit you're using. And the way to really start doing this and really looking at that improving the yield side is tracking, charting, and identifying variances and improvement in 3 key areas, which are brew house efficiency, filtration and transfer yield, and packaging yield, right? And so as you start looking at these 3 key areas, you really start breaking the systems down to be able to understand what's going on from a process optimization perspective. From there, we also look at maximizing tank turn time, which basically results in increased overall fermentation cellar capacity, right? So effectively what this means is that if you have 10 tanks and you optimize the schedule, you are basically looking at, well, instead of it taking 14 days per tank turn time, it's actually going to take 12 days, right? So that's 2 additional days that you're getting per tank, depending on your beer style. Multiply that out by across all the days in the year and number of tanks, and you start looking at really what the increased cellar capacity is. And what's great about that from an optimization standpoint and where this is profit is, well, you can eliminate and defer the need for further capital investment in tanks, right? Like effectively, if you have maxed out your entire cellar, that's when you should be looking at the next set of tanks. And if there's ways that you can say, hey, well, I just want to buy tanks right now, well, you want to start basically looking at how can you use those new tanks that you're purchasing to further optimize the tank schedule that's there. Next, from a process optimization perspective, we also start looking at analyzing and understanding key fermentation metrics. And what this is again optimizing the cellar schedules, but really streamlining recipe variations based on fermentation trends, right? And that could be things like daily gravities, pH, temperature, or VDK, and really breaking this down to understand just how the process is going from a tank by tank basis. So again, just really cool ways to start breaking down the data sets and understanding what's happening from a process optimization perspective. Number two, quality control. This is very critical when it comes to real-time alerts and sign-offs at every step of the process, right? And when you start breaking down the data, there's a really good way to identify and mitigate costly production mistakes before they move further down the process and consume additional materials, time, and tank spaces, right? This is where there's three key sign-off areas of brew finish, ready to filter, and ready to package. And what you want to do is at each particular set, you want to proactively be sure that you're measuring and understanding what's happening, because otherwise, let's say that you made a mistake in the brew finish step, but just moved it over in fermentation for 13 days, then you're about to filter it. Well, at that point, if you realize that, oh, wait, this was a mistake that happened on the brew side of things, you've already gone through 13 days of beer sitting in tank without it making you money, right? And that's really where you start breaking things down and start understanding that there's proper sign-offs and quality checks at each step of the process. And from there, as you set up real-time red, yellow, green notifications with deviations from your tolerances, the key being to intervene immediately, right? And so this is where I really want to emphasize that, yes, there are softwares like Beer30 that can do those real-time alerts and the red, yellow, green tolerances. But even if you don't want to go down the path of something like Beer30, you should be doing this with your daily spreadsheets. You should be doing this with daily email alerts that, as those aspects happen at a brewery, people are actively looking at this on a daily basis to understand just how the beer is trending over time. And that's really where the quality aspect becomes so critical from an actual profit perspective as well. From there, track the yeast pitch, harvesting, propagation data, and yeast genealogy from batch to batch. And really the goal here being to maximize repitching generations and minimizing fresh pitch costs, right? So really whatever we can do to keep the process going and actually minimize the actual cost of fresh pitching just because you're able to harvest and repitch. Again, super critical from the quality aspect of things. Number three, getting into inventory and MRP side of things. And what this really looks like is getting into data to improve your MRP, which is material resource planning. And one of the key goals here is to develop just-in-time purchasing processes for raw materials and packaging supplies, right? What this pretty much means is that if you have 3, 6, 9 months worth of inventory and raw materials just sitting on hand, that's probably not the best use of cash flow, because the goal being that you want to minimize cash and warehouse space that's tied up in excess inventory, and particularly minimize losses due to expiration of raw materials or minimize losses due to packaging materials of beers that get phased out or are seasonal, right? And so this is where if you actually start looking at the data that's there, you start really breaking this down from an MRP perspective and understanding really when do you need to order by when. So sorry, how much you need to order of a particular ingredient by when, based on lead time from the manufacturer, understanding when the next tank is going to have that beer, and really doing a very nice optimization of when you need items by and when the vendor can get those to you, right? And so that's really where the inventory and MRP side becomes critical. And this is an area where breweries are able to literally save thousands and thousands of dollars from a profit perspective and from a revenue perspective of being able to understand, well, or not revenue, from an expense perspective of being able to understand exactly how much quantity of ingredients are being stored somewhere in raw material inventory when they really should not be there, because you're not going to be brewing that for months on end. This also then ensures that you're making accurate purchase decisions to ensure operations run smoothly while keeping cash flow in check. So it becomes a really good way to make sure that from an inventory and MRP perspective, you're able to start going through and optimizing that part of the workflow. From there, number 4 is looking at your cost of goods sold, your COGS. Effectively, the key here is that you need to use the data that you've been gathering to calculate the exact cost of goods for each brand and packaging type. And what that pretty much does is that it gains visibility into the profitability for each SKU that the beer sells. Imagine you're doing a one-off brand. I'm gonna make up a milkshake IPA with pineapples, cherries, mango, guava, right? And something awesome like that where it tastes great, people love it. But if you're still looking at it from a COGS perspective, and you're charging the same amount for that particular beer versus a light lager or an IPA, you realize that the overall a standard IPA, let's say, you realize that the cost of goods are going to be very different, right? When you add in all those fruit purees, things like that. And if you're selling them for the same exact price between the lager and this, milkshake IPA that's there with a smoothie type of puree and adjuncts added in, that the delta is just not going to make sense, right? And so that's really where you're able to gain visibility into profitability based on the exact cost of making those particular beers. From there, what you can actually do is start identifying the individual SKUs with the high costs and the opportunities that are present to reduce costs with recipe optimization, right? Is there a way that you can use hop oils? Is there a way to use different extracts, things like that, to really streamline the optimization if that's part of your brand, right? Understanding how you can adjust prices to ensure an attractive margin. And again, at the end of the day, the reason why I keep saying numbers equal profits is because you're actually using the data and the numbers to tell a story for your particular brewery. And finally, tracking COGS from batch to batch, identify shifts in COGS over time, and adapt purchasing, operations, and pricing strategies. This is critical because you want to make sure to look at the variance percentage from the target COGS to actual, right? And if I know, for example, that this 24 pack of bottles or cans is going to cost me $18 to make, for example, and I then realize that, hey, over the last 6 months, that 18 has slowly started creeping up to 18.25, 18.50, 18.75, 19. Then I start looking at that percentage variance and I start realizing, whoa, something needs to change over time, especially as we know from our end that raw materials have been increasing, right? There's been other aspects of labor prices changes, etc. So really being able to break this down from a variance perspective to understand what's happening from a purchasing, operations, and pricing strategies. Number five, sales and distribution. This is one of the coolest aspects where really, if you're doing this properly from a data perspective, you can use real-time brewery inventory to showcase to team members and sales reps exactly what is available and when beers are available. And this is really critical because then your sales team can use these numbers to ensure clear inventory stock and numbers are available, setting production timelines, and making sure that the team never misses a sales opportunity. Right? As you start breaking this down from a profit perspective, you start seeing all the variables that go into this that really break things down to indicate you need to have systems in place and you need better processes. Otherwise, you're really missing out on the sales side or you're missing on the production side, and they both have to go hand in hand with proper forecasting as well. Right. And so that's where sales and distro becomes critical. And also looking at this from a perspective of focusing in on minimizing overcommitments by using the data set to work through back orders when they occur. Right? Again, the goal here being that if you're working with a distributor, if you're self-distributing, making sure that you're looking at the data to really understand what beers are going to be available by when to make sure those orders are placed in time. And if there are back orders or promises made to external people, you're properly tracking that as well. And then finally, using the data from a sales and distro side to focus in on transitioning between seasonal or limited release brands. Right. So again, being able to just tie that in with the entire story of what's happening between the seasonal, limited release, the cost of goods, how much it costs to make that beer, and then what's happening from a sales side as well. And finally, number six, time savings across the team. Right. And this is one of the key aspects I want to emphasize here is that with all this data, it can be so overwhelming, right? And that's where it becomes an aspect of consolidating all of the spreadsheets, paper sheets, email digests into a central source of truth. And if you want, that can be a brewery software like Beer 30. Or even if you don't want to go that route, you can create different pivot tables, interconnect the spreadsheets, have them self-referencing to be able to go from there to actually have a central source of truth that's giving you this data analysis. Right. And that's really where the time savings aspect comes in to indicate, whoa, this is the cool things that really make sure that your brewery is running effectively when it comes to the entire data analysis side of things. From there, use the data to work productively with task management and real-time alerts as changes are happening in the brewery. You won't under There's so many times where things are constantly changing at the brewery because we all know nothing ever goes according to plan 100% at a brewery, right? And with that, start looking at the data and start analyzing who's going to do what and the task management that's happening to make sure that there are real-time changes, as we mentioned, because otherwise your team could be packaging off the wrong SKU, or your team could actually be going in and working and dry hopping a beer that actually isn't ready for dry hop, right? And so this is where those aspects tie in with actually working proactively and productively on task management. From there, use the data and numbers to look at ways to optimize time savings. And that could be with pre-built sheets and tax reporting, because we all know that it can take hours and hours on end to set up excise tax sheets or excise tax reports. And getting into a system that gives you that within 2 or 3 clicks, whether it's your own spreadsheets or whether it's a software system, all ties in together with that. And finally, when it comes to the numbers, make sure you avoid the redundancies, right? That's the biggest aspect that I want to point out, is because if you are having somebody write stuff on a piece of paper and then a spreadsheet and then sending out an email, there's going to be potential data loss as people start fat fingering or moving particular items from paper, where that could be a 6 or it could be an 8. Who knows, right? Like, people's handwritings aren't that great. Focusing in on what happens in terms of using multiple spreadsheets and QuickBooks Online and Xero and making multiple invoices just because things aren't streamlined, and really getting into the aspect of time savings when it comes to data analysis really comes in by removing the redundancies and having that central source of truth that the entire company, all teams are looking at as well. So with that, just to wrap up here, really we've looked at what happens when it comes to the brewery health, quality, efficiency, sales, and now we're going to wrap this up with key takeaways, where the goal really is that understand the brewery's health by using data to focus in on quality, efficiency, and sales issues. With that, get started. Start taking the data and look at 3 areas of data management, but then start organizing that data and start grouping that together with 3 steps of brewery analytics. Then start reviewing that organized data to then start coming up with better areas of data solutions. And then finally, the key aspect of the talk, WTF data, numbers equal profits, is looking at 6 areas of profit analysis, right? And so that becomes a really good way to break things down, as we went through, of actually giving you examples to start thinking about when it comes to understanding what's happening from a profit perspective. And with that, really use the data to hashtag brew better beer and hashtag brew more beer. So with that, if anybody has questions, feel free to send me an email, pk@thefifthingredient.com, or visit the website, thefifthingredient.com, LinkedIn, social media. And again, a huge thank you to Andrew Copeland and the craft beer professionals community. So with that, that pretty much wraps up this aspect of the talk. If you have questions, feel free to put them in the chat. If not, definitely feel free to reach out and we can also talk about this one-on-one or asynchronously as well. All right, cool. Got one question coming in that ties in from the profit analysis side, which is question says, when it comes to the data side of things, what can we do as a company to improve the current processes for redundancies? That's a great question. What I would say associated with that is, going back a couple slides here, it's really coming down to understanding what processes are there and the investment when it comes to a central source of truth. And that central source of truth, like I said, could be Beer 30. But if you think that that's not something you want to go down, well, look at your current spreadsheets. And if you're using something like Google Sheets, build it up where they are interconnected, where when I change a particular cell for, let's say, my knockout volume, that it results in the overall batch yield numbers also changing on a different sheet that are used to track your cost of goods sold. Right. And I guess this is the key aspect that comes in with the redundancy side, is that you don't want it to be that if I change my knockout from in a spreadsheet from 32.5 to 30.1 because somebody made a mistake, that I then have to remember to go ahead and change it in 6 other spreadsheets, right? For my fermentation sheet, my filter sheet, my overall brew to package sheet. And so this is where it becomes very critical that in order to avoid those redundancies, you either go the route of having a software system for your brewery like Beer 30, or you take the time and effort to build your spreadsheets so that way they're interconnected, right? And that's the key that I want to emphasize is that you don't need to make an investment in a software system to have a central source of truth. At that point, you're just investing in your people to actually set up a particular set of spreadsheets and go from there on things. So it really comes down to this aspect of you're going to have to pay for it in some aspect, whether it's through an actual software fee or whether it's through time for your team members to actually come up with better processes. It needs to happen, right? And so that's really where you're able to start looking at the data analysis to really start breaking this down from point A to point B. All right, great. Thank you for that. Thank you, Andrew, as well for having me. Feel free to reach out and looking forward to chatting soon with everybody on the call about numbers and profits and how we can actually use data to brew more and brew better. Have a great one. Cheers. Bye.